When is Westeros? You heard me correctly there. The question is when, in comparison to the eras of our actual world, do we think the Westeros of Robert Baratheon and Jon Snow takes place? Or to put it a bit more precisely, what time period does the setting of A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones correspond to in our real world? The usual answer to this question is the Middle Ages, of course. If we look a little closer though, this answer is less than satisfying. For one thing, it's very imprecise and it may also be partly wrong. I want to demonstrate what I mean by looking at 4 different aspects: military technology, civil technology, the political system, and economy. Military technology is probably what people rely on the most when they try to come up with a comparable real-world time period to match Westeros, castles and knights probably being the main reasons. Let's first look at the knights of A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. If we take a look at the scene when Barristan Selmy takes off his armor, we get a rather good look at what top-level Westerosi armor looks like. Well, kind of, I guess. The problem is that Barristan's armor makes little sense and we will have to not take all the details completely seriously. When the Lord Commander of the King's Guard takes off his helmet, there are 2 things missing we would normally expect to see: a mail coif and some kind of padding. We can't see either, while there might be some padding attached to the helmet at least. The Kingsguard helmet also leaves a lot of openings for swords or spears. Barristan's neck and parts of his face are left exposed, and the gap between pauldrons, breastplate and helmet looks rather inviting to a would-be attacker. Real medieval helmets would have left much less area to aim for as early as 1200, and even before that there would have been a mail coif. For elite warriors comparable to the Kingsguard, this would have been true as early as the 10th century. If we don't want to compare Westeros to the early 10th century, we therefore have a bit of a problem. We also get a rather good look at the pieces that make up his armor proper. It's clearly not a complete suit of armor. Since there is no mail to be seen around the neck, there probably is none. Why bother protecting other openings if you don't deem the neck worth of such cautionary measures? There seems to be no gambazon either, and we don't know if the pieces that are there are hardened steel or not. In conclusion, the armor of the Kingsguard is not like any historical medieval armor. Too much plate for the early Middle Ages, but no gambazon or mail. So not like anything later than that. Since that's not exactly satisfying, let's look at the books instead of the show, or rather, let's look at official images first. In the graphic novels, we get pictures like these. While we still don't see any padded coifs, we do see a lot of mail. On poorer, less elite knights, we see more mail and less plate, while it's the other way around with kings and princes. We even get this, a surcoat, which would normally be worn over a gambazon and mail. Which makes sense, since those are bowmen, the raven's teeth. Mail hauberk and gambazon would protect from projectiles, while they would want to avoid close combat anyway, which means plate wouldn't make so much sense for them. The helmets are also much less open, and we even see basigues, which did not get invented before 1300. All in all, the graphic novels are a rather faithful depiction of late 14th or early 15th century armor. Not quite this, but consistently superior to this. This fits rather well if we add some other observations. Westerosi castles fit the bill of typical medieval castles from either the high or late medieval period, like the Crac du Chevalier, Malbork Castle or Bodiam Castle. Their layout has not yet been influenced by gunpowder. While firearms and artillery did exist in Europe as early as the 13th century, they did not become sophisticated enough yet to dominate warfare or dictate the layout of castles. This process did not pick up momentum until at least around 1400. Earlier cannons like the Pot de Fer came closer to what Wildfire achieves in Westeros. rather indiscriminate, explosive destruction combined with danger for the operators. With all of that in mind, we can now say that military-wise, Westeros looks a lot like 14th century Europe, the time and location of Geoffrey Chaucer, Boccaccio, Dante, Petrarch, the Black Prince, Charles IV, and actually not all that many other well-known figures, because it's already too late for what people usually think of when they think about the Middle Ages, yet also too early for the Renaissance. Having come up with a rather clear picture concerning military technology, let's turn to civil technology. For one thing, Westeros exists in a pre-Gutenberg universe. The printing press has not yet been invented. Glass windows, on the other hand, seem very common. Even the inn at the crossroads has it. While in our Middle Ages, those became the standard in churches during the 11th century, and still could not even be expected in every palace. The use of glass panes in windows would only become rather normal in private houses during the 15th century, but would still not be in every house, not even in towns and cities. In that respect, Westeros looks closer to 15th century Europe, I'd say, maybe even later than that. Ships are also interesting. There are galleasses, cocks, carracks, and dromons, but no caravels or galleons. With a bunch of longships thrown in, this makes for a decidedly mixed bag. There should be some caravel predecessor at least, judging from our earlier observations. But what we get instead is a mix of late and early medieval types of ships, some of which would never have met in the real world. The only real conclusion we can draw here is probably that this is technologically decidedly earlier than the times of Columbus, Vespucci, and their like. Turning toward the political system now, we can start by comparing Westeros at the time of A Song of Ice and Fire with the time period it has matched most closely so far, which would be around 1400. How do politics work around 1400, and how do they work in Westeros? There are actually surprising differences. Most importantly, there are next to no documents in Westeros. More specifically, there are no contracts, no deeds, and no written laws. In the real world, there is the Golden Bull of 1356, a deed which is also a law and would today probably be a contract, defining the constitutional structure of the Holy Roman Empire. There is, of course, the Magna Carta, or more precisely, the Magna Carta Libertarum, a charter guaranteeing the church and the barons protections from a king trying to abuse his power. Much like the Golden Bull, it's also much like a contract or a law. Documents like those, most of them smaller in scope of course, made up a big part of medieval politics. Yet they are absent from what we see of Westerosi politics. Surely if there were actual documents prohibiting Joffrey from giving the North to the Boltons or something like that, it would have been brought up. We never hear of any actual legal documents, not even in the context of great councils. While I am sure that some must exist, it is safe to say that they are nowhere near as ubiquitous as they are in the high to late Middle Ages. I own a whole book comprised solely of official documents concerning only one medieval king, and that's only those that survived, of course. This leads us to another difference, which has a lot to do with the first one. Westerosi politics are simple, and they must be without documents to cling to. In Westeros, the king basically can get away with only taking the great lords into account and letting them handle everything below that threshold, with the exception of capital and crownland business. This seems somewhat modeled on the Holy Roman Empire, with its 7 electors, but radically simplified. In Westeros, all the smaller lords answer to one of the great lords, who in turn answer to the king. In the Holy Roman Empire, the electors are simply the 7 most powerful lords, or rather counts, dukes, margraves, even kings and archbishops of the realm. But there are so many imperial estates like dukes, margraves, landgraves and knights of the Holy Roman Empire, even imperial and free cities and more. Each of those have the privilege of imperial immediacy. which means they answer only directly to the king. Upon closer examination, Westeros looks like a much earlier version of what would become the Holy Roman Empire, when there were still tribal duchies that covered most of the territory of East Francia. Now we are talking about the early Middle Ages, with figures like Charlemagne, Alfred the Great, and probably Ragnar Lothbrok. The case could be made that even Charlemagne lived in a world with many more legal documents than the Westeros of A Song of Ice and Fire. Our last topic is economy. In terms of finance, Westeros seems stuck in the 13th century. There seems to be only one bank to speak of, and it's not even located in Westeros, the Iron Bank of Braavos, while banks started to become a thing in the 13th century in Europe. More generally, Westeros has very few and rather small cities for basically an entire continent. This means that the ratio of agriculture to craft and trade is much more tilted toward agriculture than it already is in our Middle Ages. To find an age comparable to the Westeros of A Song of Ice and Fire in terms of the dominance of agriculture, we would probably have to go not only back to the early Middle Ages, but rather skip late and classic antiquity and go for early antiquity. So, what do we make of all this? The Westeros of A Song of Ice and Fire mixes characteristics of periods as far apart as at least 700 years, arguably much more. That said, it's not a completely chaotic mix. There is distinct order to it. In terms of technology, be it military or civilian, Westeros is clearly situated in the late Middle Ages. But in terms of social development and complexity, it is not on par with our Middle Ages, and it is not even close. Westeros stands between the dark early Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages that already feel a breeze of fresh Renaissance air because of its special climate and history, I would say. Westeros is sparsely populated because the land could not support more people during a long winter, no matter how long summers it gets in return. As a result, Westerosi society is less complex because, relatively speaking, it lacks cities and merchants and other entities that typically make for more complexity and demand a more complex political system. The existence of dragons during part of the continent's more recent history is just another impediment for political complexity. With a bunch of dragons at his disposal, a king can get away with a lot more than he could without. Political complexity quite often comes down to ways for different groups to get their voices heard, in spite of there being a king. With dragons, a king doesn't have to listen as much. The most important takeaway from this is, I think, that Westeros is not the late Middle Ages, even if it looks like it. We must be careful if we try to draw conclusions from our Middle Ages when we make assumptions about how things work in Westeros, since it is a very different beast, even if we mostly can explain it as a mere combination of existing elements. Just imagine 16th century Catholics and Protestants fighting each other with stealth aircraft and nuclear bombs. Sounds dangerous, doesn't it? It would be just about as strange a mix as we find in Westeros. That wraps it up for this video. Thank you very much. And if you like this video, please subscribe, like, share, comment, and make sure to visit the shit out of our blog.